Why would a man who once showed keen interest and sought communication now display complete indifference, as if you've become invisible to him? A legitimate question arises. What went wrong? Was something said or done that might have pushed him away, even unintentionally? However, the answer may be more complex than it seems at first glance, and the root of the problem isn't always in your actions. Often, the reason lies within the man himself and his internal struggles. Contrary to popular belief, men aren't the invulnerable and cold-blooded beings they're often portrayed to be. The indifference they show isn't always a reflection of their true feelings. Rather, it's a mask behind which they try to hide what they find difficult to deal with. And what a man displaying indifference will never admit is the storm of emotions raging inside him, which he himself doesn't fully understand. The first thought that comes to mind when a man starts ignoring a woman is that he's lost interest in her. But if that were really the case, if he were indifferent to her, would he so obviously demonstrate his indifference? Would he disappear from her life in a way that makes his absence noticeable? After all, when a person feels nothing for another, their reaction is neutral. They don't need to put on a show of disappearing. They don't need to prove their absence. But when a man ignores with a specific purpose, when he suddenly distances himself, but doesn't sever all ties, when it seems he wants his distance to be noticed, that's where his weakness lies. Feigned indifference is just a shield, a defense mechanism designed to hide true feelings. From childhood, men are taught to suppress their vulnerability. They're told that deep feelings, expressions of emotion, and even admitting that a woman has power over them are signs of weakness. Therefore, when a man starts to experience strong feelings, when he realizes that a woman occupies more space in his thoughts than he'd like to admit, his self-preservation instinct kicks in. He distances himself not because he's indifferent to the woman, but rather because she's too important. This scares him because he doesn't know how to deal with the feeling of vulnerability. And then indifference becomes his refuge, a strategy for regaining control of the situation. What will happen next? Will he be able to overcome his fears and acknowledge his feelings? Or will he continue to hide behind a mask of indifference, risking losing something truly valuable? Paradoxically, a man's demonstrative ignoring often reveals his vulnerability. Someone who truly doesn't care wouldn't waste energy proving it. Someone who has genuinely moved on doesn't resort to disappearing tactics or emphasize their detachment. A common mistake many women make is desperately trying to decipher this behavior, searching for reasons in their own actions, meticulously analyzing words, messages, and gestures in the hope of understanding what has changed. However, there isn't always a rational explanation. It's not about your actions, but about the man's feelings, which he can't cope with. So, how should you act in this situation? How do you regain control and not become a pawn in his game? The solution is simple. Stop reacting. By responding to his indifference, seeking explanations, or provoking him to respond, you're only giving him power, fueling his strategy, and confirming the effectiveness of his ignoring tactics. But by strengthening your own position, ceasing to pay attention to him, and continuing to live a full life, you change the dynamic. His vulnerability lies not in the fear of losing you, but in the fear of becoming indifferent to you. True strength isn't in trying to get a man back or manipulate the situation. It's in realizing that his indifference is his personal problem, unrelated to your self-esteem. Don't let his strategy affect your perception of yourself. A man who resorts to ignoring is insecure and not in control of the situation. He's fighting his fears, using distance as a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of confidence. As soon as you realize this, As soon as you stop looking for answers in him and start finding them in yourself, everything will change. A man's power over you only exists as long as you give it to him. By withdrawing that power, you'll make him feel the change. When a person feels the need to distance themselves without feeling it necessary to explain the reasons, this indicates not strength of character, but a deep internal conflict. Behind a man's sudden detachment, there's usually a struggle with emotions that he can't understand or control. While outwardly striving to demonstrate coolness and control over the situation, in his heart, he's tormented by a dilemma born of the fear of dissolving in his own feelings. Many men have learned a painful lesson. Attachment makes them vulnerable. They are convinced that by opening themselves up to feelings, they doom themselves to suffering, and therefore build protective barriers around themselves, resorting to unhealthy ways of self-preservation. Indifference becomes a kind of shield for them, behind which they try to hide from an imaginary danger, not realizing that this same shield separates them from the possibility of building a genuine, deep connection with another person. They prefer to retreat, to run from the impending storm of emotions rather than face it head-on. However, the paradox is that in their desire for total control, they ultimately lose it. By choosing indifference as a defense mechanism, they only demonstrate their inability to manage their own feelings, their need for distance in order to maintain the illusion of mental balance. Otherwise, the intensity of the experiences threatens to engulf them completely. Such behavior inevitably creates a painful whirlwind of doubts and questions in the other person. There is a desperate need for explanations, for finding logic in what is happening. But alas, there is not always a clear and rational answer. Often, distance arises because a person is simply not ready to withstand the closeness, the relationship that they themselves initiated. It is not that the connection was insincere, but that it turned out to be an unbearable burden for them, too heavy, too emotionally costly. When a man is not ready to live up to the role that a woman plays in his life, he will look for any pretexts and excuses to avoid this responsibility. Perhaps he thinks it's better to leave now, before he gets too attached. Perhaps he is afraid of losing the precious autonomy that he thinks he possesses. But in the end, the true power in this complex dynamic lies not with the one who leaves, slamming the door, but with the one who finds the strength not to wait for explanations that, most likely, will never come. The one who chooses freedom from illusions and moves on, not dwelling on futile attempts to understand the incomprehensible. Faced with indifference, we often instinctively seek to regain the fleeting attention, trying to understand the reasons for the change. However, paradoxically, every effort to restore the former closeness only increases the gap. In such situations, it is strongly recommended not to resort to pleas, pressure, or attempts to prove one's importance. After all, a person who needs to be constantly reminded of the value of what they have is hardly worthy of these efforts. Real change begins not with the search for external explanations, but with deep self-analysis. Instead of asking how to regain their favor, you should ask yourself, do you really need someone who needs the prospect of loss to realize your value? In men's psychology, attraction and interest are inextricably linked to a sense of challenge. What is perceived as a given quickly loses its appeal, while seeming inaccessibility becomes an object of desire. And this is not about manipulation, but about the very nature of a person striving to overcome difficulties. This is the key to changing the situation. When a woman switches her attention and stops wasting energy on someone who does not appreciate her, something amazing happens. The perception changes dramatically. A man who is used to ignoring with impunity suddenly begins to feel a real threat of loss. This feeling awakens in him the need to regain what he has lost. After all, the most vulnerable point of a man is not the loss of a woman itself, but the bitter realization that she has stopped waiting, that he is no longer the center of her universe, that his indifference has not created dependence, but has created an insurmountable distance. This is the paradoxical essence of the strategy of indifference. The one who tries to use it as a tool of manipulation ultimately becomes its victim. There is a common misconception that detachment allows you to gain control over the situation, but in reality, it lets the other person know that their presence is no longer necessary. After all, true attitude is manifested not in words, but in deeds, in how a person copes with distance. When a man suddenly moves away without explaining the reasons, without saying goodbye, and without giving clear signals, he reveals much more about himself than he thinks. Intentional absence is a kind of silent communication, a way to express what he does not dare to say out loud. However, many do not realize that such tactics, instead of giving them power, on the contrary, expose them. An emotionally mature person does not need to play indifference games to mark their territory. A confident man openly faces any situation, without resorting to manipulations that create confusion and pain. Those who have not learned to manage their feelings use distance as a shield to avoid confronting their internal conflicts. When a man ignores a woman, he naively believes that it gives him control over the situation. He thinks that by stepping back, he creates an atmosphere of uncertainty, that his absence will make him more desirable, and that his silence will make her desperately seek his attention. However, he fails to understand that in this pursuit of dominance, he exposes his most vulnerable point. After all, someone who is truly confident does not need to disappear to feel strong. He does not need to manipulate other people's emotions to validate his worth. A confident man presents himself to the world as he is, unafraid to appear vulnerable. On the other hand, the man who ignores and leaves without a clear reason is actually revealing his own fear. The fear of not being good enough, the fear of experiencing strong emotions, the fear that another person has more power over his emotions than he would like to admit. The real irony is that by trying to protect himself with a shield of indifference, he only exacerbates the disconnect. After all, a woman who respects herself will not impose herself or chase after someone who has decided to leave. She will not give her dignity to someone who is unable to appreciate her presence. It is at this moment that the dynamics of the relationship change dramatically. Some men believe that ignoring is a way to conquer territory, but they do not realize that they are actually digging a hole for themselves. When a woman stops waiting for an answer, stops wondering what she did wrong, stops analyzing every little thing in search of an explanation, that is when she regains her strength. And that is when the man who thought he had the upper hand begins to feel it slipping away. When someone who is used to playing with other people's feelings suddenly faces the fact that his tricks no longer work, it discourages him. The realization that his messages are no longer awaited, that her phone is not checked in the hope of seeing his name, and that the other person's world continues to revolve regardless of his presence, strikes a blow to his ego. After all, the one who leaves expecting to make an impression does not expect to be let go without a fight. A man's ego is often fueled by the belief that a woman will always be somewhere nearby, that no matter what, a part of her soul will belong to him. And when this illusion crumbles, when a woman who previously showed interest becomes unapproachable, there is a shift in roles. True weakness is manifested not in the ignoring itself, but in the naive belief in the infallibility of this tactic. Indifference has power only over those who allow it. But as soon as a woman realizes her self-worth, independent of someone else's approval, the situation changes dramatically. It is no longer she who suffers from the absence, but he who begins to feel the weight of his own game. Silence, which seems like a clever move, is actually a double-edged sword. Intentional disappearance, instead of attracting, can become a point of no return, forever changing the other person's perception. The one who resorts to ignoring, hoping for control, is rarely prepared for the consequences of his indifference. After all, everything that is deprived of nourishment withers, everything that is not cared for is lost. Some people are so confident in their importance that they believe they will always be remembered, waited for, and sought after. They cling to the idea that their very existence gives them the right to be desired. However, no one is immune to oblivion. A connection does not withstand the test of distance, does not grow stronger in absence, and does not arise from emptiness. A woman may admire, idealize, even patiently wait, but even her patience is not endless. When expectation is replaced by disappointment, there is a re-evaluation of values. What once aroused emotions becomes a burden, and interest gives way to indifference. It is at this moment that the strategy of ignoring turns against its initiator. There is nothing more discouraging than the realization that the other person is no longer in your life. The space he occupied is now empty, but not because she is still waiting in silence, but because she has decided to fill it with something more valuable: her own world, personal growth, new acquaintances. The fleeting nature of opportunities and the relentless passage of time are axioms of life. Every action we take is like a stone thrown into water, creating a chain of consequences, among which the loss of what was not appreciated at the right moment is especially painful. And then comes the day when a woman, previously full of hopes and doubts, eager for answers and explanations, suddenly loses interest in what is happening. She no longer cares about the reasons. She is not tormented by a sense of loss, but on the contrary, she feels a long-awaited liberation. A man who has chosen the path of ignoring, deep down, fears not a direct refusal, but a genuine indifference, which is not a tactical move, but arises from a complete emptiness of feelings. When a woman's patience runs out, there is no turning back. There's no malice, no resentment, no thirst for revenge here, just a firm conviction that further efforts are pointless. Many men only come to their senses when they feel that the one who was so accessible has turned into an impregnable fortress. When they realize that her absence brings not pain, but relief. At that moment, the indifference they considered their weapon becomes their Achilles' heel, depriving them of control over the situation. They are no longer the ones who decide when to return and reclaim the lost space. Now the door is closed, not out of pride, but because of the absence of the slightest desire to keep it open. When a man distances himself without explanation, naively believing that this will give him power, he digs a pit for himself. And it's not about the immediate consequences of his absence, but about his underestimation of a woman's ability to adapt to new circumstances. At first, surprise, confusion, and disappointment may make her doubt what is happening. But over time, the question, why, loses its relevance, giving way to an unwavering certainty that no one who truly values her would intentionally create uncertainty. A strong woman will not allow herself to wallow in pointless doubts. At first, the mind may seek excuses for his indifference, lack of time, stress, fear of commitment. But sooner or later, all these excuses crumble, revealing a simple truth. When a person really wants to be around, they will be there, without excuses, strategies, or games. A man who plays the ignoring game to evoke admiration or desire is driven by his own insecurity. He seeks to feel in control, to make sure that she needs him more than he needs her. But he doesn't understand that in this pursuit of superiority, he is only undermining his own value. After all, a self-confident man doesn't need to resort to indifference to maintain a woman's interest. That's when the turning point happens. At first, she may experience pain, disappointment, and even anger, but gradually her perception changes. She realizes that she doesn't need to wait, that her life goes on, that the world is too big to be limited by the uncertainty he left her with. And so, the one who waited stops waiting. The one who sought answers stops needing them. The one who felt the absence finds freedom. Men often mistakenly believe that indifference tactics are effective as long as the object of their attention continues to hope, strives to understand, and clings to an elusive opportunity. However, when that hope fades, indifference turns into the most destructive weapon against the one who used it. A woman, freed from the shackles of expectation, no longer feels vulnerable. It is then that the man begins to feel her absence, to agonize over questions about the reasons for her detachment, about why she no longer seeks his company, and why her presence no longer evokes the same emotions. At this moment, his greatest weakness is exposed. A man confident in his control over the situation suddenly faces a reality for which he was not prepared. She is gone. And this thought hurts him the most. Not so much because of the loss, but because of the realization that she will no longer be around. He never imagined that his indifference would deprive him of exactly what he wanted to preserve. The male mind is often guided by the mistaken belief that availability devalues, that what is easily achieved loses its appeal. Some men believe that distance creates more desire, intrigue, and interest. But they don't understand that a real woman is attracted not by playing games, but by confidence, not by absence, but by sincere presence. Fate is ironic when a man finally realizes that she is moving on, when indifference loses its power, when his strategy fails. That's when he starts looking for her. But the moment is missed. A woman who has learned to live without him is unlikely to want him back. Not out of pride, but out of the understanding that a person who disappeared without explanation does not deserve the right to return with them. The moment a woman's heart stops languishing in anticipation, a tectonic shift occurs in the very fabric of the relationship. Initially, the departure of a loved one feels like a gaping hole, like an unhealed wound that requires immediate healing and explanation. However, the relentless passage of time makes its adjustments, and what seemed vital for emotional balance gradually loses its relevance under the pressure of days, weeks, and months. The human mind has an amazing ability to adapt. Past suffering fades, giving way to indifference, and past anxiety dissolves into oblivion. And then, the one who naively believed that he held the reins of control begins to feel the ground slipping from under his feet. Many men are raised on the belief that a lack of attention ignites the flame of desire, that distance fuels interest, and that uncertainty maintains an unfading spark of attraction. That strategy only works with women who haven't yet realized their true worth. Once a woman stops measuring her self-esteem by the amount of attention she receives, the world turns upside down. What once seemed attractive now feels like childishness. What once caused a storm of emotions now evokes nothing but indifference. Some men resort to tactics of feigned indifference, believing that this way they avoid being rejected. They prefer to cultivate the image of an unapproachable monolith rather than openly admit their true feelings. However, they overlook one important point. True strength lies not in the ability to ignore, but in the courage to experience feelings without fear of judgment. Vulnerability is not a sign of weakness. On the contrary, Weakness lies in hiding behind outdated strategies, afraid of being rejected. A man who resorts to ignoring secretly fears not so much the physical loss of the woman, but the disappearance of her attention, because deep down he is not seeking solitude, but confirmation of his own importance, the assurance that there is someone for whom he matters. However, when a woman stops waiting, when the focus of her attention shifts elsewhere, when her energy is no longer spent thinking about his actions or inaction, then the man faces true loneliness. This loneliness arises not from distance, but from emotional emptiness, because he loses control of the situation, loses the ability to play with uncertainty, to disappear and reappear, knowing that he will be waited for. This is the vulnerability of a man who practices ignoring. He mistakenly believes that his indifference will elevate him in the eyes of a woman, while it makes him completely superfluous. It is at this moment that despair is born. Consciousness is filled with questions that had not arisen before. Why does she no longer respond with the same enthusiasm? Where has her interest gone? Why has her absence, which was once his weapon, now turned against him? In confusion, he searches for signs of his former confidence, but does not find them, because the woman has turned the page, leaving no room for an epilogue. The irony is that the strategy, conceived as a way to attract attention, ultimately led to the loss of everything. After all, desire is fueled not by coldness, but by presence. Interest is ignited not by distance, but by closeness. Attraction is strengthened not by games, but by sincerity. When a woman realizes this, she stops being hurt by indifference. Not because she doesn't feel pain, but because she has realized that her worth doesn't depend on anyone's approval. The key mistake many men make is that they tend to value only what slips through their fingers, unable to see the treasure until it is lost forever. The bitter realization comes too late. A woman who has tasted the freedom of an independent life no longer feels a strong need for his presence. The personal world she has found, filled with her own interests and values, is too precious to sacrifice for someone who did not appreciate her importance in time. Indifference is a double-edged sword, wounding not only the object, but also the subject. A man, hiding behind a wall of silence, naively believes that he controls the situation, forcing the woman to agonizingly guess the reasons for his coldness, to doubt herself and her worth. However, such a game of domination requires an exorbitant price. The first reaction of a woman to indifference is confusion and bewilderment. The human psyche strives for order, craves to understand the motives of every action, to find meaning even where there is none. But when the search for answers turns into a fruitless treading in place, a turning point occurs. The gaze of her soul turns away from the indifferent man and turns to the priceless inner world. And then the roles change dramatically. A man, confident in his power, suddenly notices that the interest from the woman has faded. The safe distance turns into a gaping abyss that he doesn't know how to overcome. After all, indifference is only effective as long as there is hope for a response. When expectation is replaced by genuine indifference, the game is over. Often, men make a fatal mistake, underestimating a woman's amazing ability to adapt and change. In the grip of illusions, they naively believe that by disappearing from her life, they will be able to triumphantly return at any moment, confident that she will patiently wait for their return. However, reality cruelly shatters these presumptuous expectations. No one is willing to wait forever. No one will cling to a relationship in which they do not feel truly valued and loved. There comes a moment when a woman realizes that her precious energy should not be wasted on someone who neglects her and her feelings. A radical transformation occurs. Her attention shifts to other horizons. Her mind is freed from burdensome thoughts, and her heart opens to someone who genuinely values her presence in their life. A man who chooses to ignore her, hoping to spark even greater interest, is deeply mistaken. He doesn't understand that true attraction grows not from a lack of attention, but from a strong emotional connection, a sense of mutual support and understanding. It's not fleeting uncertainty that fuels the flame of desire, but sincere emotional presence. And when a woman ceases to feel that presence, her heart gradually learns to live without it, healing wounds and gaining new strength. It is at this turning point that a man begins to realize he is losing something invaluable, something he perhaps never thought he could lose. The paradox is that many men only begin to appreciate what they have when they feel a real threat of loss. As long as they are confident that a woman will always be there, show interest, and wait patiently, they feel no need to make any effort to maintain the relationship. But when that confidence crumbles, when the woman who once sought his attention leaves without looking back, when the one who once waited begins to rebuild her life, the impact is inevitable. The overwhelming desire to control the situation turns into his greatest weakness. A man who resorts to ignoring, believing that he is maintaining power, is not actually in control. He acts out of fear of showing his true feelings, fear of losing his dominant position in the relationship, fear of not being good enough for his chosen one. However, paradoxically, in trying to avoid perceived vulnerability, a person risks ending up in a much more unfavorable position. While the woman he demonstratively ignored continues on her life path, he himself gets bogged down in the swamp of his hopeless tactics, agonizingly wondering at what point he lost control of the situation. It is at this moment that many men try to recover what they have lost, realizing that they have lost something they considered unshakable. The absence of another person turns from a simple gap into a tangible lack, causing real pain. But they don't realize that a woman who has tasted freedom and harmony is unlikely to want to return to the previous chaos. Realizing that her happiness does not depend on manipulation and emotional games, she chooses a new path. The door that was once open is now closed, not out of resentment, but because there is no point in reopening it. The manipulator's mind indulges in the illusion of eternal control. He is confident that his detachment is a foolproof tool for maintaining interest. Silence is a source of intrigue, and the lack of answers is a guarantee of uncertainty. But he overlooks the fact that patience is not limitless, and a weary heart ceases to feel the same emotions. At first, indifference may seem like an effective tactic. A woman previously persistent in seeking attention continues her attempts. The one who sought signs of attention does not lose hope. But there comes a moment when energy runs out, and fatigue overcomes expectation. And then a turning point occurs. Each prolonged absence only weakens the connection. Each silence leaves an unhealed mark. Every gap is filled with new thoughts and perspectives. And what seemed like a winning strategy turns into a weapon aimed against the manipulator himself. There comes a moment when a woman's heart ceases to languish in waiting, when her mind is freed from the shackles of the past, and her gaze turns to new horizons, and then changes occur, irreversible and profound. The way back is closed. Former feelings, awe, and admiration give way to something different, something new. The ego of a man who neglects attention is fueled by the illusion of his own indispensability, the confidence that his return will be greeted with jubilation, and his absence will leave a gaping void. However, reality cruelly dispels these fantasies. While he hesitates, hoping to make an impact, the woman transforms, realizing that she does not need external answers to move forward. What is not valued sooner or later loses its appeal, wears out. And when that happens, it is no longer possible to restore former feelings. Many men resort to tactics of indifference, believing that in this way they avoid vulnerability. They convince themselves that distance makes them more desirable, mysterious, and inaccessible. But in reality, this is just a manifestation of fear. Someone who is confident in their value does not need to create uncertainty in another's soul, to doubt their own importance. They don't need to hide their feelings behind a mask of coldness. They do not understand that vulnerability is not weakness, but a manifestation of true courage. The person who dares to openly show their feelings, express them without concealment, and demonstrate them without games, possesses far greater strength than the one who hides behind silence and indifference. Silence retains its power only as long as hope flickers in the other person's soul. But when expectation turns into oblivion, the illusory power held by the silent one dissipates like smoke. The true weakness of a man who chooses the tactic of ignoring lies not in the loss of control, but in the bitter realization that he never possessed it. While he naively believed that his absence kept the situation under control, the woman who became the object of his ignoring learned to live without him, discovering new horizons and opportunities for herself. While he indulged in the thought that silence would make him more desirable, she grasped the priceless value of her own life, which turned out to be much richer and more interesting than the company of a man unable to appreciate it. And now, the moment of truth arrives. He realizes his loss, and his mind plunges into chaos. There are no more longing expectations on her part, no questions, no pleas for attention. Now he himself feels the oppressive weight of the emptiness he created. He is tormented by doubts about the correctness of his decisions. He painfully tries to understand at what point the turning point occurred. But time is lost. The woman who has learned to live without his presence is unlikely to want to bring him back into her life. A broken feeling cannot be glued together so that it regains its former strength. Every decision has its consequences, and whoever chooses to ignore must be prepared for what awaits him ahead. At first glance, this may seem like an effective strategy for arousing interest without making much effort. But over time, indifference becomes a mirror reflecting the true essence of a person, their fears, insecurities, and inability to cope with their own emotions. What was conceived as a tactical move to gain power turns into an insurmountable barrier, preventing the establishment of a genuine connection. The woman, initially embarrassed by indifference, gradually realizes that the reason lies not in her, but in the man who chose such tactics. Her value does not diminish because someone decided to turn away. Her significance does not depend on the attention she receives. And at this moment, something irreversible happens in her soul. Her horizons are no longer clouded by former illusions. The energy, once given without reservation to someone who did not bother to appreciate her, is now directed in a different direction. The world, as before, makes its relentless run, but her personal trajectory lies in a completely different direction. The irony of fate is that insight comes late to those who have neglected, when the loss becomes obvious. Absence does not immediately make itself felt, but when a person gets used to life without the former presence, when their thoughts cease to wander in the labyrinths of unfulfilled hopes, and their heart opens up new horizons and incentives for moving forward, indifference loses its power as a weapon and turns into a heavy burden. There is nothing more painful than realizing the loss of something that was once available. There is nothing more disturbing than understanding that a person who showed interest is now unattainable. There is nothing more destabilizing than knowing that someone has gone ahead without looking back. This is the Achilles heel of a man who chooses the tactic of ignoring, in the naive belief that his absence will forever carry weight, while it is his indifference that ultimately negates his significance. The delusion lies in the idea of love as a battlefield of strategies, where distance fuels attraction and mystery is synonymous with attraction. In reality, interest is maintained not by uncertainty, but by genuine connection, not by coldness, but by authenticity, not by fear of loss, but by a willingness to create something real. Those who prefer to ignore, who sow doubts instead of confidence, who see power in absence, ultimately realize that they have missed a unique chance. And when they try to return, restore what was lost, correct what was done, they are faced with a harsh reality. The person they ignored is no longer the same. Their consciousness has undergone changes. Their heart no longer beats with the same force. Their gaze no longer seeks what once seemed necessary. It is at this moment that indifference becomes the most severe sentence for them. While a man indulges in the thought of omnipotence, a woman deprived of his attention paves her own way to happiness and freedom. The male mind, striving to preserve the illusion of power, erects walls that only isolate him from true desires. Indifference turns into an impregnable fortress from which he watches life, not daring to act. But time is relentless. Every minute spent without participation, intention, and effort weakens the connection between them. Attraction, like a flame, needs constant nourishment. Without actions to support it, it gradually fades away. A woman may be willing to put up with uncertainty for a while, but not forever. Her patience is not limitless, and when the limit is reached, the energy changes direction. Former interest gives way to indifference, doubts dissipate, revealing a clear picture. The power game loses its significance, and at this moment, the transformation becomes irreversible. A man who neglects attention naively believes that he will always play an important role in a woman's life, that his absence will be more significant than his presence, that his indifference will generate need, not rejection. But in reality, he just becomes unnecessary. There is nothing more dangerous for someone who seeks control than losing significance. When a woman ceases to feel and see meaning in a relationship, a man who has chosen silence as his strategy digs his own emotional grave. He naively believes that distance is a game that only affects the feelings of another person, not realizing that this strategy has a downside, affecting him as well. When he realizes his mistake and wants to return to the comfort of the former relationship, seeking warmth and admiration in the eyes of that same woman, he will only be met by an unassailable wall of cold indifference. And it's not about hatred. She just no longer sees him as part of her life, a person necessary for her happiness. A man's absence only hurts when a woman is still emotionally involved in the relationship. But once her mind ceases to associate him with positive emotions, when her heart no longer seeks protection and support in him, and her energy is directed towards new horizons, everything changes dramatically. Former anxiety is replaced by indifference. Thoughts of him give way to new interests, and the past becomes just a memory that no longer has its former power. The delusion of many men is that they consider absence to be a manifestation of power, when in fact it is just cowardice disguised as a strategy. Someone who really wants to be around, who values the connection, does not resort to such games. Someone who cherishes relationships will not manipulate the feelings and mind of another person. A man who chooses to ignore as a way of self-protection ultimately risks losing everything. When the realization of the mistake finally comes, the damage done may be irreparable. The woman who once waited patiently is no longer interested. The one who was looking for answers has already found inner peace. The one whose heart was filled with feelings now feels only emptiness. And then despair overwhelms the one who naively believed he was in control of the situation, because he suddenly faces the emptiness caused by her absence, the heaviness of silence, and the realization that there is no turning back.